everyone, and welcome through the Blackthorn Arch, a podcast all about the folk tales, fairy lore, and spooky encounters of the UK. My name is Hearth, spelt Hearth, and today we are going to be talking about the Green Children of Woolpit. Now, I'm sure some of you will have likely heard this story before. It is such a fascinating tale that bridges the gap between misunderstood medicine and the supernatural. And to this day, we still don't entirely know what happened in this story. We don't really know where these children came from or why things played out the way they did. Now, the village of Woolpit is in Suffolk. It's around 7 miles or so from Bury. And it's a very unassuming place. You could walk around today and you probably wouldn't notice the deep, rich lore and mythology that surround this particular area. But Woolpit is probably most well known for one event that happened a very long time ago, that being the appearance of the Green Children. The name Woolpit comes from the term wolf pit. The village was actually named after these large wolf pits or wolf traps that were used to trap the wild native wolves that were still roaming the British countryside in the 12th century, which is where our story takes place. It's believed this story took place during King Stephen's reign. It was a very tumultuous time. The kingdom had been at civil war for the last 20 years, between 1135 and 1153. After the death of King Henry I's heir in 1120, Stephen and Matilda fought ferociously for the crown, while the rest of the country was left to starve and suffer in brutal war and hardship. For those living in the hamlets and villages in this local area, their main goal was simply to survive the winter. They focused primarily on growing crops and on livestock, and they spent their entire year readying the harvest to try to keep themselves fed and keep the wolves from the door. And although that might be a turn of phrase today, I'm referring to actual wolves. See, during this time, wolves were still wild in the UK. A lot of people don't realise it now, but wolves are actually native to the UK. It was only through repeated trapping and killing that wolves eventually died off. But it's believed that up until around 1680, populations of wild wolves still roamed the British Isles. And for small villages and hamlets, particularly during the 12th century when the populations of wolves were quite high, this was a problem. You had very scared people living in small countryside hamlets and villages who were entirely reliant on their livestock staying safe, or they would starve when winter came. And so Woolpit, like many villages and hamlets around the UK, used wolf pits as traps to stop the wolves from reaching the village. And it's these wolf pits that the story today surrounds. Between 1135 and 1154, it was harvesting time in the small village of Woolpit. This was a very important time. You had dozens of harvesters out in the fields gathering crops, and this is when they heard the cries of children. Now, hearing children wasn't all that unusual. The farmland wasn't far away from the village itself. However, what made these cries so unusual was that they weren't in English. Upon searching for the children, the harvesters found them trapped at the bottom of one of the wolf pits. Getting them out, the children themselves seemed relatively unharmed. They were, however, different than other children these people had seen before. They were wearing strange clothes in fabric they'd never seen. They spoke in foreign tongue, and they were green. Like actually green. Now, for reference, these wolf pits are not shallow holes in the ground. They are not gentle sloped or easy to access. They are sharp, vertical drops deep into the ground, the sides of which have been lined with stone to stop the banks from collapsing. There's only one way in and one way out, a vertical drop from the top. These children had found their way into a wolf pit, and yet had come out relatively unharmed. The harvesters took these children back to the village, where they were taken in by a Sir Richard de Calne, who lived just 6 miles away from the wolf pit where these children were found. Now, upon arrival, everyone was relatively startled to see these children. It was quite unusual to see children just roaming around from outside the village, and the fact that they were green made it all the more alarming. The children were offered food of different sorts, and they rejected all of it. They refused to eat anything until they were offered broad beans from the garden. These beans they rapidly ate, and for a while, these green beans were all the children would eat. Slowly but surely, the children's diets were expanded. They included more breads, they included more oats, and the girl began to get better, stronger, more confident. The younger boy, however, really struggled to adapt. He wasn't able to eat the food as readily as his sister, and slowly he became ill and ultimately died. While her brother had passed away, the young girl was stronger than ever, and slowly but surely, the more time she spent in Woolpit, the less and less her skin was green, until ultimately she looked like any of the other children of the village. Eventually, the young girl was taught English, and she was finally able to explain her story, where she was brought up, how she came upon Woolspit, and why she was green. Now, we only know of this event because of the writings of two medieval authors. The first is Ralph of Coggeshall, the second is William of Newbridge. Both of them use second-hand accounts to document the events between 20 and 100 years after they happened. And from these original writings, which were in Latin, we have translations of what is believed to have been said by the young girl, and also the events that took place from the perspective of the people in the village of Woolspit themselves. Now, these stories do vary, and it's very interesting to see how only 20 years after an event took place, we're already getting variations in the story. So what you believe or choose to not believe is going to be entirely up to you. But what I'm going to be reading now are the quotes that have been taken from the translated resources. And as always, any resources that I've used in this episode are available in the episode description. When asked to tell her story, the young girl is believed to have said, quote, "We are inhabitants of the land of St. Martin, who is regarded with particular veneration in the country which gave us birth. We are ignorant. Oh, only remember this, that on a certain day, when we were feeding our father's flock in the fields, we heard a great sound, such as we are now accustomed to hear in St. Edmund's, when the bells are chiming, and whilst listening to the sound in admiration, we became on a sudden, as it were, entranced, and found ourselves among you in the fields where you were reaping. The sun does not rise upon our countrymen. Our land is little cheered by its beams. We are contented with that twilight, which among you precedes the sunrise and follows sunset. Moreover, a certain luminous country is seen, not far distant from ours, and divided from it by a very considerable river." This is one version of the story, where the girl claims to come from a land with no sunlight, only twilight. Now today we might recognise this as being somewhere quite far north that goes through very large cycles, such as the Arctic Circle. However, even the Arctic Circle has periods, usually very long months, of entire sunlight and entire darkness. This girl claimed that she had never experienced sunlight in her entire life, and that no one around her had either. It's a really interesting story, but this is just one of them. There are several stories that have been documented that each vary slightly. The translated account written by Ralph of Coggeshall goes as follows, quote, "Another wonderful thing happened in Suffolk. At the St. Mary's of the Wolfpits, a boy and his sister were found by the inhabitants of that place near the mouth of a pit which is there, who had the form of all their limbs like to those of other men, but they differed in the colour of their skin from all people of our habitable world, for the whole surface of their skin was tinged a green colour. No one could understand their speech. When they were brought as curiosities to the house of a certain knight, Sir Richard de Calne, they wept bitterly. Bread and other victuals were set before them, but they would touch none of them, though they were tormented by great hunger, as the girl afterwards acknowledged. At length, when some beans just cut with their stalks were brought into the house, they made signs with great avidity that they should be given to them. When they were brought, they opened their stalks instead of the pods, thinking the beans were in the hollow of them, but not finding them there, they began to weep anew. When those who were present saw this, they opened the pods and showed them the naked beans. They fed on these with delight, and for a long time tasted no other food. The boy, however, was always languid and depressed, and died within a short time. The girl enjoyed continual good health, and becoming accustomed to various kinds of food, she lost completely that green colour, and gradually recovered the sanguine habit of her entire body. She was afterward regenerated by the lava of holy baptism, and lived for many years in the service of that night, and was rather loose and wanton in her conduct. Being frequently asked about the people of her country, she asserted that the inhabitants, and all that they had in that country, were of a green colour, and that they saw no sun, but enjoyed a degree of light like what is after sunset. Being asked how she came to this country with the aforesaid boy, she replied that as they were following their flock, they came to a certain cavern, on entering which they heard a delightful sound of bells, ravished by whose sweetness they went for a long time wandering on through the cavern until they came to its mouth. When they came out of it, they were struck senseless by the excessive light of the sun and the unusual temperature of the air, and they thus lay for a long time. Being terrified by the noise of those who came on them, they wished to fly, but they could not find the entrance of the cavern before they were caught. Now, this is a really interesting account. It's very wordy. It is very much a translation of the 1800s. I think it was translated around 1860, and you can really tell it in the language. But in this, we learn even more about the story of these siblings. Not only were they green, but apparently everyone and everything they had ever known was also green, which is very hard to imagine today for us because everything around us has its own varying colour. But for them, everything was green. Now, this is really the first mention of a cavern or a cave, but this is then documented by other people. These children lived in a world that had no sunlight and only greenery, and then coming across this world accidentally, became trapped. Now, it does use the word fly, but I don't believe it means fly as in physical flight. Instead, I believe it means to run away or to flee. But when they attempted to do so, the entrance to the cavern was gone. So the entrance to whatever cavern they had come out to had led them directly into the bottom of a wolf pit. The children didn't appear to have any physical ailments when they were taken out of the pit, and to fall from such height would probably cause some kind of physical damage. So did this cavern enter directly into the bottom of the wolf pit, where they then became trapped and ultimately began crying out for help? It's a really interesting account. How accurate it actually is debatable, because even the original Latin was documented several decades after the event actually took place, and then the translation several hundred years after that. This, however, isn't the only documentation of this event. There is another one that was written by William of Newbridge, and it goes as follows, quote, "According to him, the place where the children appeared was about 4 or 5 miles from Bury St. Edmunds. They came in harvest time out of the wolf pits. They both lost their green hue and were baptized and learned English. The boy, who was the younger, died, but the girl married a man in Lena and lived many years. They said their country was called St. Martin's Land, as the saint was chiefly worshipped there, and the people were Christians, and had churches, that the sun did not rise there, but that there was a bright country which could be seen from theirs, being divided by it by a very broad river." Now, this account doesn't mention a cave. It actually doesn't mention much about how the children got there at all. So this is a really interesting aspect of this, and it does touch on the fact that the young girl did go on to live a long and what we can only hope is a happy life. It is said that she is baptized, and she later marries who we believe to be the Archdeacon of Ely, Richard Barr, at King's Lynn. Now, he is the ambassador of Henry II, and she ultimately took the name Agnes Barr, and it's believed that she went on to have one child, although this is unverified and the documents for this time period are questionable and spotty at best. But this is such a fascinating story. We see so many different additions to it. It's very hard to tell what was originally there and what has been added on during time. Now, especially this story, the one that is documented and translated from William of Newbridge, adds extra information about Christianity being added in, and it's quite likely that this was added in at a later date. Now, during this time, Christianity was a new and upcoming religion. It was very, very popular, but a lot of the people of the land actually still followed pre-Christian traditions. So the idea that everyone, even people that came from another place, would also follow Christianity is an unusual addition, and I'm not certain whether this is an original point or whether this was added or assumed by William of Newbridge. We will probably never know. This story is so old that we can't actually pin a date on it. We have about 20 years during the 12th century where this might have taken place. But even then, the dates are spotty at best, and they might not even be accurate. So ultimately, there's so many theories surrounding all of this, some of which are very extreme, some of which are more scientific and medical, and one of which is my personal favourites, and those are what we're going to be going through next. But I do think it's important to note that some of these theories are very time-specific. They rely on this event taking place at an exact point in history. And the reality is we don't actually know when this event happened. We believe it took place anywhere between 1135 and 1153, but really there's no set reason for that. It's simply based on the documented accounts that were taken several decades afterwards. And so not all of these theories are going to pan out the same, depending on where in that date range you are going to put this event taking place. Now, the first theory is chlorosis. Now, chlorosis is a medical condition. It's also known as hydrochromic anemia, and it essentially causes the skin to turn green due to a lack of suitable nutrition. Now, this could certainly be the case, and it actually works alongside other theories that we're going to be talking about. These children, depending on how long they might have been lost for, could have developed this due to not having nutrients on their journey. However, it does make you question, if everyone that they had ever met was also green, did everyone have this? Or was this something that was just natural to the people that they belonged to? It's a really interesting one, and it definitely works alongside other potential theories. Now, the next one is a little bit harder to believe, but it's the idea of arsenic poisoning. Now, arsenic was used in a lot of green pigments, it was used in wallpapers and paint and decoration and clothing, and it is very, very deadly. And so it was questioned, would a low dose of arsenic actually turn the skin green? Now, I'm pretty certain, based on my own research and scientific research, that arsenic doesn't actually turn the skin green, but it was a theory that was put forward. Perhaps these children were actually poisoned slowly over time, and then they were dumped on another kingdom's land to perhaps get rid of them, but these children weren't quite as gone as maybe was assumed. Now, this would explain why the children seemed to get better over time and why the young boy did become ill and die, because arsenic is a very powerful poison, but it's highly debated whether arsenic could even turn the skin green. But it would explain the delirium that the children maybe were experiencing and the altered states of memory. The third theory is that these children might have been Flemish refugees. Now, during the 12th century, many Flemish immigrants arrived in Britain, and in around 1173, many of them died in the Battle of Farnham, which took place in St. Martin's, just a few miles from Woolpit, across a river. Now, this does tie in to what the girl said, that she could see a bright land across a large river. It may also explain why the children were green. If they weren't getting enough nutrients because of the battle and because of the situation they were in, they may well have developed chlorosis. And it does also explain why the harvesters weren't able to understand the foreign tongue that these children were speaking in. However, this theory falls apart a little bit when we think about the dates. This war didn't happen till around 1173. The story is believed to take place between 1135 and 1153, so at best it is 20 years before this war happened, and at worst it's 40. That's a huge gap in time. And also, the gentleman who took in the children, Sir Richard de Calne, was a very highly educated man, and it was likely that he had encountered Flemish individuals before and would likely recognise the language, even if he didn't necessarily understand it himself. So that's a really interesting one, and a lot of people do believe that. I just get confused over the dates a little bit. 40 years is a big difference if the children appeared, say, in 1135. The war didn't happen till 1173, and although these dates might seem very insignificant to us now, being so drastically far in the past, it's the equivalent of the children arriving in 1970 and a war happening in 2020. You know, that's quite a large expanse of time to have passed between the children arriving and a war that was meant to have caused their arrival, but it is definitely a theory. Now, the fourth theory gets a little bit more out there. You'll notice we slowly start getting more extreme as we go through this list, and that is that the children and their families were from a world inside the Earth. A lot of people will read the stories and the accounts and they will hear information that makes them think that these children maybe lived inside the Earth, or at least underground. The idea that they exited through a cavern and were abruptly met by bright light. The fact that the temperature was different. Now, we don't know if the temperature was higher or lower than what they were used to based on what is written, but it is mentioned that there was a drastic temperature change. Now, could this be because the children were usually from inside the Earth rather than outside it? A land of twilight, permanently lit with the light just before sunrise, but without a sun. It makes people think that perhaps the reason there was no sun was because they were inside the Earth. You couldn't see the sun if you were inside. And then the idea of people being all green, everything being green, it's an interesting one, and I'm not quite sure how I feel about it. For me, I personally am not sold on this one, mainly because if you're going to be underground, more likely than not, there's going to be no light. Not twilight. Twilight is actually enough light to work by. Where was this light coming from? And it opens up even more questions, and I'm really fascinated to see what people think of this one. Now, theory number 5 is, of course, aliens. I think we all saw this one coming. The green skin, the foreign language, the different clothes. A lot of people do believe that these children may well have been aliens, and they accidentally found themselves here. And while the boy couldn't cope with the change in lifestyle, the girl was able to assimilate into society. Now, this is not one that I personally hold much stock in, but it definitely is an interesting theory. A world where you live in eternal twilight, but are all green, and no one has ever seen you before, makes people think aliens. Now, my personal favourite theory is number 6, and that is the association of this story with the fair folk, or fairies. I've spent a lot of my life studying British folklore, spirit stories, and more specifically, fairy legends in the British Isles. And everything within this story has a tint of fairy added into it. Now, within Celtic cultures, caves and caverns are associated with transition. They are portals to the Celtic otherworld, or the realm of the fairies. Caves are seen a lot in transitions between our realm and the realm of the fairies, as are bells. Now, if you remember when we were talking about the story, the children followed the sound of bells. Now, bells are seen throughout British mythology surrounding fairies. Usually before fairy encounters, there is the ringing of a bell, which is trance-like, and it may lead you astray, lead you away from home, lead you away from safety into another place. Now, usually this is documented from being on the side of humans, but what if it can also happen from the side of fairies as well? Now, fairies are typically represented as being human-like, but not entirely. The colour of their skin is usually not the same as ours, and so green skin might not be all that uncommon. Now, within fairy mythology, especially within Britain, there is typically this belief that the fairy plane is atop ours. It is the same but different. And so these children trying to find green beans in the stem of a bean plant instead of the pod might be because of that. These children say that they were following sheep before they got lost. Well, sheep are something that we typically associate with our world, but what if they're also present elsewhere as well? And it leads to so many questions, and I love this kind of story because of its fairy associations. Now, during the 12th century, even up until the 17th century in Britain, fairy mythology was considered a standard part of day-to-day life. Fairies were associated with liminal places, the in-betweens, the time before the sun entirely rises, the time before the sun entirely sets, the in-betweens of caves, of the edge of forests, of beach and sea. And so I find it quite interesting how in this particular story, they talk about a world in twilight, a world permanently in a liminal space. And then they exited that world and into our world through a cave system, another liminal space. And this may well be the influence of fairy belief systems overlaying an actual historical event. During this time period, people were leaving out offerings for fairies every night. They respected them and they worked with them in their day-to-day lives. Even for good Christians, they were still following aspects of fairy belief systems that were simply a part of living on the land. So ultimately, this might have been a story with very simple beginnings. It might have simply been two children who crossed a river that they shouldn't have crossed, who ended up in a land with people that they didn't know and didn't understand. And then over time, you end up with extra amounts of fairy lore being added on top. And you can see how things change, how things develop. Even in 20 or 100 years, the story has changed quite dramatically. And it's one of those stories that gets me every time, no matter how many times I read about it. It fascinates me because I can see all of the connections and the associations with the fairy mythology that we see going back hundreds of years in the British Isles. And so this could be an actual encounter with fair folk, or it could simply be a standard story of two children getting lost, and then all of the fairy association has been added on after the fact. But ultimately, no matter what the story is, some things have remained the same throughout. The girl, Agnes, went on to live what we can only hope was a positive life. However, the younger brother sadly passed away. And in the end, these children never saw their family ever again. Whether they are fae or extraterrestrials, whether they live under the ground, whatever it might be, they still never got to see their family ever again. And I think that's a really sad bit of this, that yes, they adapted, yes, they made the best of it, but their family probably didn't know where they were. They maybe never knew where they were. And these children never got to see their parents or their other siblings ever again. Having just two children during the 12th century was very unusual. Usually families were huge. These two siblings might have had 5, 6, 7 other siblings that they never got to see ever again, which I think is truly heartbreaking in this story. Now, the Green Children of Woolpit have become legend. People talk about them all over the world, and within Woolpit, they actually are found in the embroidery on the altar cloth of the local church, and they're also seen on the village sign. So I hope that you did enjoy this episode. I loved researching this story. I would love to know if any of you have any of your own opinions about what happened to these children. Where did they come from? Were they fairies? Were they aliens? Were they Flemish refugees? Did they simply have a medical condition? I would absolutely love to know, either in the YouTube comments or you can contact me via the podcast platform that you are listening to this on. Ultimately, though, I hope that you did enjoy this episode. If you are listening to this in podcast form and would like to see associated photos, these episodes are available on YouTube through the YouTube channel through the Blackthorn Arch. If you're on YouTube and you would like to listen to these episodes on the go, they are available via podcast streaming platforms. All information and references are going to be found in the episode information if you would like to know more and do some of your own research. I hope that you are having a wonderful day. I hope that you did enjoy this episode, and hopefully I can get you through the Blackthorn Arch next week for another episode. Stay safe, everyone, and I will see you soon. Bye!